I'm Wayne Shepherd talking with Dr. Gary Chapman, the author of The 5 Love Languages, a revised edition, Gary?
Yes, after all these years, we've done a little tweaking on the text.
So how much different is this new edition?
Well, it's not radically different. I didn't change the 5 love languages.
You didn't add 5 more?
But we do have more contemporary examples of couples learning to speak these languages.
Yeah. For those who are picking this up for the first time, take me all the way back to the beginning, which was what? Nearly 20 years ago now.
Yeah, it first came out in 1992.
Did it? Okay.
And I remember the publisher said to me when it first came out, this is a nice little book. I think it'll sell a few thousand copies.
Did you have trouble getting a publisher?
No, not really, because I had already published 2 books, and so there was no trouble getting it published. But I think all of us underestimated what would happen to this book.
Mm-hmm. Tell me the story. What has happened to this book?
Well, it's been out now for 15, 16 years, and every year it has sold more than the year before. Total sales in English now is over 5 million copies, been translated in 38 languages around the world. So it has really just blown our minds to sit back and watch, how this book has been used to help so many couples learn how to reconnect with each other.
For those who don't know the story, where did this come from in your own heart and mind, Gary?
Well, it came out of my counseling experience. I've been in marriage counseling for over 35 years now, just working with hundreds and hundreds of couples. And I realized that after a while that I was hearing the same stories over and over again. They would sit in my office and one of them would say, I just feel like he doesn't love me. And the other one would say, I don't know what they want. I do this and this and this, and they don't feel loved. I don't understand this. And so I would try to help them understand what made her feel loved, what made him feel loved, so that they could start, expressing love that way. So I went through my notes after probably 12 years of notes and asked myself, what are people crying for? When they say I don't feel loved, what do they want? And their answers fell into 5 categories. I wasn't looking for 5. It's just they fell into 5 categories. And it was later then I called them the 5 love languages. But I started using the concept in my counseling and in small groups. And every time I did, people got it, and they said, oh, yeah. And so after a while, I thought, if I could put this in a book and if I could write it in the language of the common man, I could help a lot of people. So there's not a lot of psychological terms in this book or, theological terms. It's just I'm trying to write so the average guy and gal can get it.
It's simple. It's straightforward. It's easy to understand. Yeah. Isn't it amazing how God has used that?
Well, it is. And a lot of people have said to me, I read that and I thought, why didn't I think of that? It seems so simple, and it is simple. Now, it's not always easy to implement,
right?
Because many of us grew up speaking only 1 or 2 of these languages. That's all we heard in our family. So if you talk about physical touch, and I was not touched, I was not in a touchy-feely family, that's hard for me to learn to touch. And the same thing is true with words of affirmation. If you didn't get words of affirmation, it doesn't seem natural to you to be saying these things, to your spouse. So it's not easy for everybody, but it is simple to get the concept. And the good news is you can learn to speak these things. And when you do, it makes a tremendous difference in your marriage.
You must have collected stories through the years of people whose marriages have literally been saved because of the 5 love languages. Can you tell me a couple of those stories? I even have one of my own. I talked recently with a cousin of mine who's in his 40s. He and his wife are separated. They're still separated, but he is devouring your book. Yeah. He came to me with it. He said, hey, have you ever heard of this book, The 5 Love Languages? See, this is great stuff. I'm going to win my wife back with this.
Wayne, every week when I do marriage seminars, I do about 30 seminars a year all over the country. They're Saturday events. Every Saturday, I have half a dozen people come by and say to me things like, we were that close to divorce. Somebody gave us your book. We read it. It made sense. We tried it. It turned our marriage around.
What have you got to lose, right?
Absolutely. And so, yes, and the book is just filled with these kind of stories, of course. But every week I hear that. And to me, it's so encouraging because it says to me that the book is continuing to speak to people. People are still discovering this book. After 16 years, they're just now discovering, and that's new to them. And when you do discover it and apply it in your marriage, it makes a tremendous difference in your marriage.
Gary, tell me more what goes on inside you when you hear people come to you and say, God has used your book this way in my life. But for both you and your wife, because this has been a team project, hasn't it?
Well, it has been. And, my wife and I originally wanted to go to Africa. That was our goal, to go to Africa and teach in a seminary, train national workers how to reach their people for Christ. And we were turned down because of my wife's health. And they said she would not survive in another country. Well, she's done well through the years. She's learned how to cope with things, and she's done well. And we were very disappointed. It was very disturbing to us. But then as the years went along and I began to write books and so forth, they send us all the editions of all the foreign, send us copies of that. And
you're fluent in all those languages.
Yeah, right. People think if I write in their language, I can read their language. But but my wife and I pray for the countries and we pray for the books when the books come in. And I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, we had opened up a box of books and I looked up at my wife and she was crying. And I said, Carolyn, why are you crying? She said, Gary, I'm just remembering. We wanted to go to the mission field. And now your books are all over the world. And it was just that moment of, in which we just realized the sovereignty of God over our lives. Mm-hmm. He had all this in mind. When we were turned down for the mission field, it never crossed my mind to write a book. In fact, it never crossed my mind to get into counseling either.
God had a better idea.
God has a way of channeling our lives where he's prepared us to minister. When I went to college, I never thought about going into counseling. In fact, when I was in graduate school and seminary working on my PhD, they didn't even have a PhD in counseling in seminary. They didn't have a master's degree in counseling in seminaries. So my counseling, I learned after I got out of school. After I got my PhD, I learned how to counsel. And so my PhD was in adult education. How do adults learn, But I got in the church and I found out people are hurting in their marriage and they want to talk about it. And so I read everything I could and learned everything I could. And all of my counseling, came out of the foxhole.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting. I'm sure you talk about this in the book, but what if a husband and wife aren't on the same wavelength at all? Yeah. And let's say the wife picks up this book, thinks this is great, and wants to implement this, but her husband's not cooperating.
Well, I find that often in my counseling. A wife will come alone, or a husband will come alone and say, my husband will not come for counseling. He won't even read a book. He won't even talk about us. And they come very defeated, but they come also asking, is there anything I can do? And what I've done many, many, many times through the years, after I've heard their story and felt their pain, I share the concept of the 5 love languages and how all of us desperately need to feel loved. And that just as the wife feels unloved sitting in my office, the husband probably feels unloved too. He's at home, but he won't come for counseling, but he doesn't feel loved either.
He's clammed up about it.
Yeah, right. And so I share with her that concept and that the most powerful thing we can do for another person is to choose to love them in their language over a long period of time, unconditionally, no matter how they respond.
No payback?
No payback at all. Just don't expect anything. And over and over again, I've seen those husbands, or sometimes it's the wife, who melts when they start to get love in their own language. I remember years and years ago, a wife stopped by my office and she said, I'm on my way to the lawyer's office. I don't know why I came in here. I know I've heard about you. I knew this was where you worked, and I just came in to see if you'd happen to be free. And I just want to say, I don't know why I came here. And then she poured out her story of a husband who basically had neglected her for 20 years. She said he works all day. He has an automotive shop in the backyard. He works on cars in the evening. One night a week, he goes out with the guys and drinks. He doesn't get drunk, but he comes home. And she said, he expects me to have his meal ready every night. He expects me to have his clothes clean. He expects me to have sex with him at least once a week. And that's all there is to it. And I get nothing out of it. And she said, I've just had it. But after I explained this concept to her, and this was the first case where I'd ever done this, I said, would you be willing to do a 6-month experiment with me? And I explained the concept. You love him in his language, no matter how he responds. And she said, well, Dr. Chapman, I guess I don't have anything to lose. So she called the attorney from my office and said, I'd like to postpone my meeting. And so we started this process. I met with her every 2 weeks. And the first 2 weeks, he didn't have any response at all. No response at all. And after the second 2 weeks, he said to her, what's going on with you? And she said, well, you want to know the truth? I've been going over there for counseling. And she said, I'm trying to be a better wife. He said, well, I knew something was going on. And so she kept speaking his love language. And about another 3 weeks or so, he said, I don't know what you're trying to do, but it isn't going to work. And she said, what do you mean? He said, well, you've been kind. And he said, I don't know. It's just not going to work. And she said, well, look, I told you what I'm doing. I'm trying to have a better marriage. I'm trying to be a better wife. And so he walked away, and it was probably another week. And he said to her, I don't know what you're doing, but it's not fair. She said, what do you mean? He said, well, you've been very kind to me. And he said, I'm not much of a husband. He said, it's not fair. She said, look,
he's feeling the weight.
He's feeling it now. See, and she said, well, I told you what I'm doing. I'm just trying to be a better wife. It's probably another month that he came and said to her, you got anything I can do for you? She said, well, if you'd like. So she asked him to do something for her, which was in keeping with her love language. Sure. And then about every couple of weeks, he would say to her, anything I can do for you? So she was teaching him how to speak her love language. He knew nothing about the concept, but she was teaching him how to love her. And after the whole thing was over, she told me, she said, Dr. Chapman, I would never have believed it. I would never have believed that man could love me like he's loving me. And I've never met the man. But he tells people in the community, and they've told me, He said, you know that Dr. Chapman? He said, that man is a miracle worker. He said, change my wife. But the fact is, I'm not a miracle worker, but love is a miracle worker. Love works miracles in people's lives.
What's the oldest couple you've ever talked to who's used the 5 love languages to turn things around? Well,
I specifically think of a couple who've been married for 30 years, and I give that story in the book. 30 years they've been married and had a miserable marriage and turned the whole thing around with the 5 love languages. But I have many couples who come to me who say, we've been married 40 years, 45 years, but this thing has helped our marriage. We had a fairly good marriage, but man, it's better now.
By that time, you've learned just to tolerate each other. That's and right. Just coexist, right?
Yeah, or you have learned, how to work with each other, how to accept the things they're not going to change, and how to, you've changed some things, and you've learned how to not fight every day.
So in many ways, it's even more amazing that a couple like that can find new hope and new life in their marriage.
Yeah, and that's what encourages me is that all ages, a lot of couples say to me, of course, somebody gave us this book for a wedding gift, and we read it before we got married. And I said, well, that's good, because then when you come down off the high, you've got the concept.
And you will come down.
Yeah, you will come down. Then you know how to love each other. But also, we have a lot of older couples who say, we thought we couldn't learn anything else, but we've learned something here in this 5 love languages.
Mm-hmm. Does your wife have people come up to her and say, boy, that husband of yours, he must have it all together. He's written the book on the 5 love languages. He must be a great husband.
Well, if they've read any of my books, they know any of my other books, they know that we had a lot of struggles in our marriage in the early years. I've been very open about that. And my wife and I agreed years ago, if we were going to help people, we had to be open and honest with them. But the reality is, life is good when you love each other and you speak each other's language. I never walk out of the house, Wayne, never. But what my wife will say something positive to me about, you're the greatest. Hope you have a good day. It's going to be wonderful. Thanks for all you do.
Let me guess, your language is
words of affirmation.
Yeah.
And before I leave the house, I always take the garbage out. I always pick up things.
Acts of service.
So, really, it creates a happy, warm, loving relationship, which is what God intended marriage to be. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of weeks ago, Wayne, my wife came home to me and said, I met this lady in the grocery store. My wife always meets people in the grocery store.
She's that kind of person. I've met her, I know.
She talks to strangers and to spend 30 minutes with them. But she said, this lady said to me, after she found out who I was, she said to me, that book on the 5 love languages of children, which is, another book that I wrote on this topic with Dr. Ross Campbell. She said, we have a 10-year-old son. And she said, he's just been obnoxious. And she said, we've had such a hard time with him. And she said, I read that book and I realized that his love language was words of affirmation. And we realized that we had been giving him critical words for just a long time because he just didn't do things. We were on his case all the time verbally. And she said, we realized we were just killing this kid. So my husband and I agreed that we were going to start looking for positive things about him, and we were going to start verbalizing positive things to him. She said, we did that. And she said, within 2 weeks, his whole countenance had changed. She said, it's amazing what happened when we started giving him positive words.
They blossom, don't they?
Yeah. And she said, now he's doing the things we tell him he needs to do because he feels loved by us. And she said, you tell your husband that book has worked miracles for our son. And so those kind of stories also I hear, not only on how this works in marriage relationships, but how it works with children and teenagers. Let's face it, teenagers are going through a lot of changes inside, emotional and intellectual, and parents who don't understand this concept, the teenager won't feel loved. You're loving them, but they don't feel loved. And, they sit in my office after they've gotten into trouble, and they say to me, my father doesn't love me. He loves my brother. He doesn't love me. And I know the father loves the kid, but the kid doesn't feel love. So I'm hoping that, the love languages of children and teenagers will continue to help parents do what they really want to do, and that is love their children effectively.
I know there are many editions of this book, different aspects of the love languages. You and I have talked before about you have to be careful, of course, for instance, physical touch, but a manager to his employees. Yeah. There are lessons to be learned here of how to manage people.
Yeah, and we're working now. I'm working with Dr. John White on a project that will take this into the marketplace because we believe it has tremendous implications in the marketplace. If people feel appreciated, and normally in the marketplace we use the word appreciate rather than love, but it's an emotional thing.
Yes.
If you feel appreciated by your employer, then you work. You give yourself to the job. I was Wayne in a business some time ago, and I met a guy who said to me after he heard this concept, he said, I've been working for this company for 20 years. I've been very creative. I think I've done a good job. I've made a real contribution to the company, but I've never had anyone in this company verbalize to me that they appreciated what I was doing. I almost cried.
Mm-hmm.
20 years of working and nobody had ever spoken his language.
That's just punching a time clock, isn't it?
And he didn't feel loved, even though he felt he was being creative and made a real contribution to the company. So, I think if managers and owners can get this concept, it has tremendous application in the workplace.
Gary, what is more important, that we understand ourselves and know what our love language is, that we're hoping that someone will speak into our life, or that we learn the love language of those around us?
I think it has to be both, Wayne. It can't be one-sided. Certainly, we need to understand our love language. That way, we can communicate to people. If you want to do something for me that would be meaningful, this is what it would be, So we need to understand it so we can reveal ourselves to each other, and especially in close relationships, like in marriage or family. But I think also we have to learn the language of the other person. Otherwise, we can be very sincere and still be missing each other. And I believe there are literally thousands of couples who are loving each other, but they're not connecting. They are sincere, but they're not touching the heart of the other person. And that is why I think this book has helped so many couples, is that they were trying, they wanted to love, they thought they were loving. In fact, in their heart, they were loving, but they realized, it's not getting through. But if I do this, it gets through, And so when that happens, then the whole marriage flourishes.
Where's this going? What's next for you?
Well, I don't know. I think, as I said, I'm working on a project on taking this into the marketplace, because I think it does have implications there. That's my next project. I'll be working on that next year. Other than that, I don't know. I just kind of sit back and watch what God is doing with what has already happened. Huh? That's right.
Well, Gary, I think I speak on behalf of all those people who are going to hit the play button on this audiobook now, and thanking you for these many years of development of this theme, this simple theme of the 5 love languages. It has the power to change a person's heart and their marriage, really, doesn't it?
Well, I really believe that's true, and that's why I'm so excited about this book. I think it's going to continue to reach out to touch people. And I think the reason this book has been so successful is that the people who have read it or heard it share it with their friends, and then their friends share it with their friends. And so the circle keeps going out. And I believe that together we can change things in this country. If we can restore the family, marriage being first, and then the family, so it becomes a loving, supportive unit, we can change the climate of our society.
The 5 Love Languages, The Secret to Love That Lasts, the newest edition from Dr. Gary Chapman. Gary, thank you.
Thank you.
For Oasis Audio, I'm Wayne Shepherd.